In the summertime of 1930, an English teacher was feeling bored while he was marking a huge pile of exam papers. So he took his pen and scribbled,
"In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit."
That man was J.R.R. Tolkien, and that line went on to become the opening sentence from The Hobbit, published in 1937. And of course, this then kicked off the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was then published in 1954. And we both know how that went on to totally change the fantasy landscape. But I can't help wondering, if Tolkien lived in our modern world with all of our distractions and devices, would he have reached for his phone and scrolled on TikTok instead of writing that iconic line? And maybe that's a bit of a ridiculous thing to think about, but it just got me thinking about the nature of boredom in the creative process. Because from having published 4 fantasy novels and a video game, I've found that boredom is a hugely essential and underrated aspect of my own writing process. And whenever I've been in those states where I've been able to harness boredom correctly and actually leverage it for my creative process, the writing has always felt so much easier and so much better. So I'm about to share 6 principles you can use to harness the incredible creative powers of boredom in your own writing process so that you can be writing better fantasy stories, avoiding writer's block, and becoming a more productive and prolific writer. And the first principle is to understand the 2 outcomes of boredom. Whenever you're bored, you really only have 2 options to escape it. Option 1 is distraction. So these are things like scrolling on TikTok, looking at Instagram reels, watching YouTube videos when you know you should be working. Hopefully you're not doing that right now. Basically, a distraction is something we do to give ourselves a cheap dopamine hit because we don't feel like we're getting enough dopamine or enough reward from the task that we are supposed to be engaged in. Now, often you tell yourself, I'm just gonna do this for a few minutes and then I'll get back to work. But if you're being honest with yourself, those few minutes usually turn into 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and before you know it, you might have spent a whole hour just randomly scrolling through your phone. But distraction can also crop up just in our day-to-day lives. Say you're going to meet up with a friend to watch a movie, and maybe you get there a few minutes before your friend. It's very easy, and I would say the majority of people in our modern world will resort to looking at your phone while you're waiting around for your friend. It's very rare to actually just be engaged and just waiting peacefully in that situation. And you might think that this form of distraction, this kind of time-filling distraction to cope with being a bit early for something or waiting in a queue, is more harmless than the earlier distraction I mentioned, the kind of distraction we associate with procrastination and not getting our work done. But I would actually argue that this second form of distraction, this coping with waiting distraction, can be more destructive to your creativity and to your growth as a fantasy writer in the long term. And you're going to see why that is over the course of this video. Okay, so that's the first option to escape boredom, is distraction. The second option is creativity, and this is exactly what Tolkien did. He was bored while he was marking these student exams, so he took his pen and he just wrote down this random sentence idea he had. And if you think back to your own childhood, this is probably something you did a lot. You used daydreaming as a way to cope with boredom, and you probably don't have many experiences as a kid of actually being bored because you were constantly coming up with your own games, you were constantly inventing your own stories. And for a lot of us who are, pursuing this goal of writing fantasy books, this is maybe one of the big things that actually got you into writing in the first place, is the daydreaming you maybe used to cope with the mundanity of regular life. And this is really where we want to be getting to with boredom. You want to be getting to the place where whenever you feel bored in your life, you don't reach for your phone, you don't reach for this external dopamine, these external distractions, but rather you look inwardly. You look to your own imagination, you look to your own creativity, and you use that to generate cool ideas for your story, whether it's a story that you haven't started writing yet, whether it's a story that you're in the process of writing the first draft of, or perhaps, like myself right now, you're in the final editing phases of the story. And it's all about giving yourself these little sparks of insight that you can then use when you sit down to write or edit your manuscript. So how can you be leaning towards imagination and creativity instead of distraction whenever you face boredom? That's what the rest of this video is going to be looking about, starting with principle number 2, which I call the Neil Gaiman gaze. So about a year and a half ago, I set myself the challenge of trying to write like Neil Gaiman for 7 days. I actually made a video about it on this channel. It was one of the first videos that kind of blew up on here. And it was a really useful challenge to try to adopt the techniques and the principles of one of my favorite writers to help me when I was going through the first draft of Kingdom of Dragons. And one of the most useful things that came out of this process was his method for kind of avoiding distraction while you are actually engaged in writing. So he sets himself a very simple rule.
All I'm allowed to do is absolutely nothing or write. And what I love about that is I'm giving myself permission to write or not write. But writing is actually more interesting than doing nothing after a while.
And this is such a liberating and powerful technique that I've continued to use ever since I discovered it, because it does give your brain just enough of a pressure release vessel when you're writing that you don't need to feel like you have to be always putting words down on the page, but it makes sure that your brain doesn't use that pressure release vessel to go off and scroll emails or look at your phone for messages, etc. And many times too, when you are stuck at the writing at hand, the solution is not to abandon it and go off and do other tasks. It's simply to just let yourself stare out the window for a little bit and allow room for your subconscious to bubble up and process these ideas. The number of times I've felt stuck while writing, and I felt extremely tempted to just kind of abandon things and maybe go and check emails or something like that. But I've just told myself, no, just stare out the window for a few minutes and maybe something will come to you. The number of times when something has actually come to me has been incredibly powerful, and it's been incredibly useful for me in my writing process. The third principle is to become a watchful waiter. So this is so incredibly powerful, and you can start using this probably multiple times in the week ahead after you watch this video. And it is whenever you are early to an event, or you're waiting around in a queue, or you're basically in a situation where you've got a couple of minutes to kill and there's not really anything to do, don't pull out your phone. Just be a watchful waiter. Observe the things that are going on around you. I kind of like to think about this in terms of every second you spend staring at your phone while you're out in public waiting for your friend to arrive, or for an event to start, or for you to go through a line into a restaurant or whatever it is. Every second you spend staring at your phone is another second you can't spend absorbing the human interactions that are going on around you. And as a writer, these moments are so incredibly precious. The number of times I've just been out in public waiting around and I've resisted the temptation to look at my phone, and I just allow myself to be and observe and be present in what's going on here. I've heard so many useful snippets of dialogue from people talking, or even just seeing how different people behave and how they themselves are dealing with the waiting. All of these little psychological tidbits find their way into my writing in one way or another. And an exercise I often like to do, particularly when I'm on the bus and just going around, and lots of people on the bus obviously just heads in the phones, earphones on, that sort of thing. I find it's really useful to kind of just imagine stories about the people that are around me. So maybe there's someone further down the bus and they're talking really loudly on their phone. I could just get pissed off at that and be annoyed, or I could try to invent a little story about this. I could tell myself, okay, well, this person's wearing a business suit, they're talking really loudly on their phone. Maybe they're like talking to a coworker and they're trying to like energize themselves. They're trying to project a sense of bravado because they're going into the office for a pay review meeting later that day, and they really need to get this pay raise, because if they don't, their crippling gambling debts are going to send them underwater, and that's going to mean that they're going to have to break up with their fiance or something like this. Now, it's probably not actually what's happening there, but it's a really interesting exercise you can use as a writer to just test your creativity and to explore your capacity to add sort of psychological depth and these interesting details to your characters. And then that feeds over into your writing in a really useful way. So next time you're waiting around, just observe and see what you learn. Principle number 4 to leverage boredom to be a better fantasy writer is to get off the cocaine pellet dispenser. So the cocaine pellet dispenser is a term that just refers to anything that gives you a quick hit of unfulfilling dopamine. So it might be scrolling social media on your phone. It might be checking emails to see if anything important has come through for work. It might be looking at your messages to see if anybody has texted you. Now, all of these things are fine if done in moderation, but there are so many people I see who are just utterly addicted to these things, in the same way that you get rats in some scientific experiments where they've just basically given them the option to press this lever for a little pellet of cocaine or press this lever for a pellet of food. And in all of these experiments, they just keep hitting the cocaine pellet dispenser over and over again until they starve to death and die, because it gives you this short-term pleasure that feels better in the short term than the food, even though the food is actually the thing you need in the long term to survive. And of course, cocaine, incredibly addictive, so that really feeds into things here as well. But if you think about our modern society, we're really not that different to these rats in a lot of ways. You've got all these big social media companies that are making money the longer you stay on their website, the longer you engage with their apps, the longer you see ads on their website, etc. I think there was a study that my friend shared with me a little while ago saying that the average user is worth $340 a year to Instagram, based purely on the average value that advertisers are paying, sort of per view on there. And so when you start to see statistics like this, you really get an appreciation for how much incentive there is to keep you glued to these devices. The same engineers that develop slot machines in Vegas, a lot of them end up getting hired at these social media companies as well. And this is probably not news to you. I think everyone is kind of aware of this by now, but it's still something that you need to be reminded of, I think. Because the more cheap dopamine you're getting from these sources, the harder it can be to motivate yourself to write, because writing is not a activity that gives you a tremendous amount of short-term pleasure, but it is something that in the long term, you'll be glad that you've done it. And the longer you write and the more you kind of get into the process of bringing your story and your characters to life and exploring this incredible world you've created, the more fulfilling that will become. But it's important to make sure that you don't allow that fulfillment to be derailed by all of the short-term intense pleasures of the cocaine pellet dispensers that are out there. Now, you've probably got one thing that comes to mind when I give you that term of cocaine pellet dispenser here. For some people, maybe it's your email. You compulsively check it multiple times a day, even though really you could get away with maybe just 1 to 2 batch checkings throughout the day. For other people, maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's constantly looking for messages, or even allowing notifications on your phone to constantly be going off. A tip that's going to save you so much grief if you haven't already done this is just have your phone in do not disturb mode all the time. Unless of course you like really need it for calls for work or something like that. But for most people, and certainly for me, I don't need it to be constantly notifying me every time someone posts like a picture of their food on Instagram. Like that's just not useful at all. And when you have all these notifications and these pings and rings and dings from your phone that are just going off at every single moment of the day, it's really difficult to cultivate the boredom necessary to then engage creatively with the ideas of the stories you're trying to bring to life. And something that can further help you develop more intrinsic drive to work on your stories is principle number 5. Occasionally select the low stimulation option. Drive with no music or podcasts. Go for a walk without listening to anything. Eat your food without watching something on TV or on your phone. Work or study without music in the background. There are so many things in your life right now that you are bringing more stimulation into than is necessary. And it doesn't mean you have to cut these out entirely. I love listening to podcasts while I go for walks. I love listening to podcasts while I'm in the gym. But it is a really good exercise every now and again to wind these things back and to occasionally explore the low stimulation option. I've done this quite a bit in the last week in sort of preparation for this video, just driving around without listening to music or podcasts. And the immense creative benefits that come from this activity is incredible. It's such a useful practice. Even this morning, I went for a half an hour walk and I wasn't listening to any podcasts or anything. I was just thinking about what I wanted to talk about in this video. And so many great ideas came as a result of giving myself that space and allowing my subconscious to have room to bubble up to the surface. I think in our modern lives, you can almost imagine our conscious mind as this very thick layer of ice that goes over a lake. And the more stimulation that you bring into your life, the thicker and thicker that ice becomes, and the harder it gets to go down into the subconscious waters, which are hidden beneath that ice. But when you occasionally select the low stimulation option, it allows for pockets to crack open in this ice. And that makes it easier for the subconscious to actually reach into the surface and give you the ideas you need to write the stories that you're working on. And this is particularly important if you're right now engaged in the process of writing the first draft of your fantasy novel and working on it every day. And I should mention here as well that if you do want to develop better writing habits and that the things I've been talking about in this video seem like they're going to help you with your process, then you can go a lot deeper with habit formation in my Easy Writing Habits course. We've had a ton of students go through this program that have doubled or even tripled the amount of words they write on a daily basis, which if you think about that over the course of a 20, 30, 40, 50-year writing career or whatever you have stretching ahead of you right now, that could mean you're doubling or tripling the amount of books you get to write in your life, which is pretty powerful. One of my students, Jesse, told me that he wrote 70,000 words within just a few months of joining the course. And he's probably finished the manuscript right now as I'm actually recording this video. And so if you want to learn more about the writing habits process I've used to personally write over 1 million words in my own author journey, which has resulted in my 4 published books and my video game, along with a bunch of other projects that weren't good enough to get published earlier on in my career, then you can check it out using the link in the description down below or going to easywritinghabits.com. And then the final principle number 6 for leveraging boredom to become a better fantasy writer is to fill the boredom with notes and ideas. So if you've been following all of the steps in this video, hopefully you've created more mental breathing room in your own life. And what you should be doing now is ensuring that you always have a notebook that is easy for you to write in, because you're going to find that more ideas will come to you now. Now that you're allowing more kind of space in your days and you're stimulating yourself less, you can then redirect that newfound mental energy towards writing down ideas for your story. So I always like to have a notebook at hand on the bookshelf behind me. I think just up behind these books here, you might not be able to see it on the camera. I've got probably like 20 notebooks there that I've filled up over the years. And actually writing this down by hand in a notebook, I find so much more useful than just writing it in a phone or something, because the actual process of handwriting helps you generate further ideas. The number of times I've sat down to write a one line or one sentence idea in a notebook, and then it has just of its own accord expanded to fill 2, 3, 4 pages is ridiculous. I've even had whole novels that have come to me like that. Across the Broken Stars, I sat down and planned to write out just a few lines, and then a couple of hours later, I had filled up like 10 pages of my notebook with a complete outline for the story, and 80% of what that story became was defined by that single session. That wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't first created the conditions to reduce my stimulation and allow myself to be bored. And then number 2, direct that boredom towards creativity. And then number 3, have a way to easily capture and store and actually develop those ideas even further than their initial thoughts. If you would like some even more in-depth, scientifically backed principles on reducing the dopamine and the stimulation in your life so that you can develop more creativity and improve your writing habits, then you might want to check out this video over here. Keep writing and keep striving.